Welcome back to the Chad Hasty Show, News Talk 95.1 FM, 790 AM KFYO. Joining us on the phones right now, Republican strategist Matt Mackowiak. Matt, good morning. How are you?
Morning, Chad. I'm doing great. How about you?
Doing great. Appreciate you joining us today. Let's start off with, obviously, the big statewide story that occurred on Friday, a very sad story of the school shooting there in Santa Fe, Texas. Elected officials spoke out and talked about what needed to be done, what should be done. What did you take away from elected officials' responses here in Texas? Did they seem to have everything kind of together in their response?
Well, look, I think when these things happen, there's almost nothing you can say that will, number one, comfort those who are going through something this horrific, or number two, provide a comprehensive solution to prevent something like this from happening again. It takes time to study, exactly what happened, why it happened, if laws were sufficient, if they weren't, if the government's response was sufficient, if it wasn't. So, look, I think between the governor and lieutenant governor, they both got, some attention in the hours following, this school shooting. I guess I would point to two things. As it relates to the governor, he really did two things. He, number one, said he's going to hold a series of roundtables this week to look for solutions. And then two, he pointed to a program you're probably familiar with in Lubbock, a mental health reform kind of pilot program that exists in your school system out there that actually was funded with about $500,000 of grant funding from the governor's office, where they try to interdict students who may become violent early on in junior high and early in high school, try to diagnose them. Parents have to consent at every stage. And there have been something like 40 students, I think, taken out of the school that they were in, or put into a different school, or even into a hospital. And so that program is one that I know Abbott feels strongly is a model that they could look at statewide potentially, or certainly in other school districts. So that was his response, was to focus in those two areas. As it relates to the lieutenant governor, obviously he got a lot of attention and even some criticism for talking about the number of entries and exits at schools. The left really, went after him for saying that, and he was on a couple Sunday shows on Sunday morning as well, making those points, but also talking about violent video games and a number of other issues. I have believed for a long time that, if schools were as secure as banks or airports, we wouldn't have school shootings. Obviously, there's a huge cost given the number of schools we have in this country. But it sure seems to me like, making our schools hard targets, would make a lot of sense. And honestly, I don't understand why school districts aren't doing that themselves. Mm-hmm. So, look, what a public official says the day of or the next day after a major shooting like this is not ultimately going to matter long term. What's going to matter is does the state of Texas come together to try to address this shooting? I don't know that there's a perfect solution. This kid stole guns from his father, who legally owned them, and you're dealing with a shotgun and a revolver. I don't think anyone, even the most unhinged gun control advocate in the world, would propose confiscating shotguns and revolvers. You'd be talking about tens of millions.
Well, there is a piece in Esquire magazine today talking about that. So
there
are a couple.
I gave up my Esquire magazine subscription long ago, so unfortunately that doesn't surprise me. But so I guess my point, I'm rambling here a little bit, but my point is just that this particular school shooting does not have many of the elements that previous school shootings have had in terms of the type of weapon, in terms of access to weapons. And so I actually think because of that, you may not see all that much attention paid to this story. This story is not quite as useful to gun control advocates as some of the other stories have been. And I think that's part of the reason why, honestly, this hasn't been wall-to-wall. They've still been focusing on Russia and other stories on cable news.
Well, and they've been bringing the Parkland kids in. You don't see a lot of the Santa Fe kids because this is from what I know about this area, it's a conservative area. And there was a girl in the New York Times who was quoted of going up to the governor and saying, "I wish our teacher was armed." And so what you see from the national media is they're bringing the Parkland kids in to comment on what happened in Texas, instead of interviewing the Texas kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you have any doubt about the national media putting their thumb on the scale, that's a pretty good example of how they're doing that. It'll be interesting to see whether some of the survivors in Santa Fe become national stars like the Parkland kids did.
Yeah.
But I don't want to look at it really through that lens and really be that sort of crass about it at this point. Look, the bottom line is this. The state of Texas is not going to move in a direction of significant gun control.
Right.
Anyone that thinks they are doesn't understand the state. I saw the New York Daily News attack the lieutenant governor on the cover on the front page of their newspaper this morning. That's a huge political gift to him. For folks that are way out there to try to propose those kinds of solutions that might work in urban cities like Chicago or D.C. or New York, it might be palatable there. They're not palatable in the state of Texas. And so, but I will say this, and this does put policymakers, both at the statewide level and the legislative level, in a corner where they've got to respond in some way to try to make this less likely in the future. I was looking at the story this morning, Chad. A kid walking into a school with a trench coat in late May when it's 90 degrees everywhere should have sent alarm bells off to begin with.
Yes.
So maybe we need to start banning trench coats after March 1st. I don't know what the answer is, but I think the governor is going to hold these roundtables this week and going to try to find some solutions. And I imagine that there will be some things that move through the legislative session next year to try to address this. I really think that mental health reform pilot program that you have in Lubbock is a great example of something that everyone can and should support.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take a look at some national headlines. President Trump wants the DOJ to look into whether the FBI infiltrated or surveilled his campaign. This is this is starting to heat up a little bit for the president.
Yeah, it is. There's no question about that. We could be entering a consequential week here. There was a little bit of chatter that perhaps this was going to be a moment where Sessions and Rosenstein were going to have to face a choice. I mean, the president tweeted late last night that he was going to call on DOJ to investigate the circumstances surrounding this FBI informant, this London-based FBI informant who apparently met with 3 separate Trump aides throughout the campaign. And so, there was a lot of chatter on Twitter last night that, this is the moment. This is the moment where DOJ is going to push back. Well, in fact, they announced almost immediately, in what appeared to be something of a coordinated effort, that they were going to ask the Inspector General to actually expand the current inquiry to look at this issue. So that got in some way addressed. It'll be interesting to see whether that's sufficient for the president. But look, this thing is certainly reaching a new phase here. We're getting closer and closer, I think, to the president and his legal team facing a decision about whether they're going to be voluntarily questioned. You still have a few other individuals who have not yet been questioned, including Roger Stone, including Donald Trump Jr., including the vice president. You have this IG report that was set to be released, I think, as early as this week or perhaps next week, which was going to look at how the FBI and the Justice Department carried out all of these things over the last 2 years, which I think a lot of people have been prepared for that to be quite critical of the Obama administration and how they did things. So I don't know. I mean, every week it feels like we're getting a little bit closer to it all coming to a head, but it's coming to a head in separate directions. And so I don't know how it all is going to play out. Of course, Rudy Giuliani said he expected Mueller to wrap things up by September 1st, particularly if the president submitted to an interview with the mutual goal being that no one wanted this issue to play a role in the fall midterm elections. So, yeah, there's a lot kicking around right now, and there's certainly a lot of information that we all want to know and see where this is going to ultimately lead.
Yeah. Matt, tell folks how they can sign up for your newsletter and what your podcast is over this week.
Absolutely. Thanks. Yeah, we do a morning email with all the top news from around the state of Texas. We put it into a real easy-to-read format and send it every weekday morning. It's called Must Read Texas. 3,000 Texans receive it, and you can sign up for a free 1-week trial at mustreadtexas.com. I have a podcast with the Washington Times. It's called Mac on Politics. We've done 83 episodes, I think. Our most recent episode is with Mark Dubowitz, who's the president of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's been called one of the most influential voices on the Iran deal. We talk about that and some other issues in the Middle East. You can find the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, and on the web at mackonpoliticspodcast.com. We have 115 five-star reviews.
Very nice. Matt, as always, appreciate your time, and have a good week and a good Memorial Day weekend as well.
Same to you. Thanks, Chad. Take care.
Thank you. That's Matt Mackowiak, Chad Hasty Show, KFYO.